Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, May 26th, 2025, and our friend Professor Jeffrey Sachs is back with us. Welcome back, Professor.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
The positive face of the Trump administration, to my understanding, is Steve Witkoff. He's somehow the new sort of fresh air to the foreign policy of the United States. But at the same time, we see that the establishment, if we assume that we have some sort of division within the Trump administration, they're forcing Witkoff. They're putting a lot of pressure on him. What do they want from Witkoff with the negotiations with Iran?
Well, the United States has a deep state. That means that it has a standing security machinery that is a big business, well over $1 trillion a year, very powerful, organized at the Pentagon, the CIA, the Armed Services Committees of the U.S. Congress, think tanks all up and down the East Coast of the United States funded by all of this, and the Israel lobby, which is, of course, ardently anti-Iran. And the Israel lobby absolutely coincides with the deep state and the military-industrial complex of the United States. So there are powerful political forces that have been in play for 46 years, actually, at least since 1979. Against Iran, and they don't just go away because Trump wants to avoid a war. We see the same in Ukraine. Trump wants to end the U.S. engagement in Ukraine, but I'd say most of the people around him continue the deep state policy that the U.S. should invest in more war. After all, it's the Ukrainians dying, not the Americans dying. And so this phenomenon of a divided Washington, because the president, in this case, actually on the more peaceful side, and the deep state is pretty much a militarized and warmongering set of institutions because war is their business and it's big business. This is not shocking. The question is, what will happen? Who will prevail? There's a famous line of Vladimir Putin in an interview in 2017 to Le Figaro, where he said, and it's become quite famous, he says, he's worked with many American presidents. He said they come into office with some ideas, and then men with briefcases and dark suits and blue ties come to visit them and explain realities to the U.S. president. And as Putin says, and those ideas are never heard of again. And what he means is that presidents get talked out of their peace initiatives. And Trump absolutely could get talked out of this. You've got a wall of opposition to making peace with Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. There's so much warmongering in all of the European capitals, virtually, certainly in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Warsaw, to continue the war. And you see it in the United States, even on Trump's own team. Kellogg definitely is basically on the European wavelength on this. He doesn't want peace with Russia. At most, he wants kind of freezing the conflict, but NATO enlargement and so on. So Trump has to grapple with a war machine which defines the U.S. government. And we've had other presidents. The last one that really tried to make peace a center of the administration was actually John F. Kennedy. And many people, including myself, think he was killed because of those actions, because the deep state, in that case, probably elements of the CIA, said, we're not going through with this.
We know that Marco Rubio is talking about snapback sanctions, which were considered in JCPOA during the Obama administration. When you look at this current situation of Iran today, and where they're talking about snapback sanction, they're considering Europe together with Russia and China. Where are we with the situation of snapback sanctions? How much pressure they can put on Iran?
Again, I'm not in these negotiations, and there is absolutely a wall of anti-Iranian sentiment in Washington. And one of the issues that Iran faces is that even if it reaches an agreement, the U.S. can change its mind or change its policies or use a pretext to reimpose sanctions or walk away from an agreement. After all, the JCPOA was laboriously negotiated in 2015 and 2016 by real nuclear experts who came up with a good agreement, and then Trump and the Senate just absolutely ripped it to shreds. So on what kind of sanctions and whether Iran will agree to something that is very flimsy and can get them into, again, another trap. I'm not in the room, but if I were Iran, I'd worry about it.
Yeah. Donald Trump's recent visit to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar, and they were so generous to Donald Trump. What do they want from Donald Trump? They consider the United States as their friend, but when it comes to the Middle East, what's the main concern on their part?
They all host U.S. Military bases. They all want to stay in power. They all think that the United States can provide them with the wherewithal to stay in power, and they all worry about being on the wrong side of the United States, given the very strong military presence of the United States in these countries. I think that that's the main motivation. Frankly, I don't think they get a lot out of this relationship, not the way that they think. The Middle East is unstable, basically because of U.S. foreign policy, defending an absolutely rogue state, Israel, rather than defending international law and creating the state of Palestine. And the burden of that U.S. defense of Israel hurts everybody in the Gulf region. So I don't think that they're getting what they think they're getting out of this relationship. I think I wish, and I think the Arab world should be more clear to the U.S. We want peace in the Middle East. Peace requires two-state solution. You got to get on with it, because otherwise this doesn't work. It's perpetual war. That's bad for business, bad for our security, bad for our stability. And that's the truth that I hope someone's explaining to Trump. I'm not sure. There was a lot of glad handing and a lot of announcements of trillions of dollars that are going to be invested in the United States. But what did the counterparts get out of that? Not clear.
The dangerous part of what's going on in the Middle East is an Israeli attack on Iran. They're talking about if they stop negotiating with the United States, we're going to attack them. If they progress in the negotiations, we're going to attack them. Is there any sort of limit on the part of the Trump administration for Netanyahu, for Netanyahu's Israel, for his administration, for Netanyahu and his administration when it comes to Iran?
This is the trillion-dollar question. The United States has run U.S. Middle East policy for decades. Whatever Israel has done, the U.S. has backed. And during this whole disastrous period of recent years, when Israel is destroying Gaza and killing tens of thousands of people, there basically hasn't been a peep from the United States to stop all of this. And so the question of whether the United States is ever going to stand up to an absolutely extremist Israeli government is a big question. The Israel lobby is extremely powerful in the United States. By the way, in terms of votes, far and away the power of the Israel lobby is evangelical Christians. It's not a Jewish lobby. It's very heavily by the numbers an evangelical Christian lobby. But it's a big part of Trump's base. And whether Trump can be president and do what's right for the United States, or whether he'll follow this part of his base, which is very extreme, a decided minority of voters, but a significant part of Trump's own voters, remains to be seen. Of course, it's been a disaster for decades. The United States has basically done what Netanyahu has said, and it's not surprising, but it is terrible. We have war in Gaza, we have war in the West Bank, we have war in Lebanon, we have war in Syria, we have the threat of war in Iran, we have war in Libya, we have war in Sudan, and Israel's played a very bad role in fomenting or encouraging many of those conflicts, if not all of them in some sense.
Can we say that the most important countries when it comes to their influence in the Middle East are Iran and the United States? Because I don't see Russia and China are somehow involved in that rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But overall, when you look at the Middle East, the United States and Iran are so bold. Is that the case in your mind?
I think it's more complicated. There are many actors that are significant in the Middle East. That's one of the reasons why it's so complicated. But don't leave out Turkey and its role. Don't leave out Saudi Arabia. Don't leave out Egypt with its 120 million people, its fragility in some ways, its historical role in the region, its still significant role as home to Al-Aqsa and other leading institutions. So for me, the Middle East is a confluence of grand civilizations that go back thousands of years. They're all still present. The Persians, the Turks, the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims across the region, and the Arabs. I mean, it's complicated. So it is not just the United States and Iran, and great powers have been meddling in this region. Also, I think it's right to say 3,000 years. So you've had endless wars because this region is so important to the world as a center of civilization, a crossroads of civilizations, a crossroads for physical trade routes, and all of that remains true today.
Can you compare China's behavior and attitude in the Middle East to the United States one? Because there's so much different attitudes there. And is the United States going to learn from China if they're much successful? They're much more successful than the United States.
Well, statecraft in China and statecraft in the North Atlantic world, meaning whether it's the UK or the US or Western Europe, are completely different historically. And I think completely different in self-perception and in future behavior. You know, in international relations theory, as taught in the United States, it said, oh, states behave the same way no matter who they are. I think that this is absolutely not the case. China has never had overseas empires. China never meddled in the Middle East. The Middle East was dominated by Britain and, to a lesser extent, France for a very long time. After World War II, the United States carried the baton that Britain had before World War II as really the undoubted regional hegemon in the Middle East. Britain and the U.S., of course, overthrew Mossadegh in 1953, the Iranian elected prime minister, creating tumult that would follow for basically 70 years onward. So the U.S. is an imperial power. It learned its methods of imperial rule from Britain. The U.S. is an Anglo-Saxon country by origin and elite culture, and it behaves like an empire. It behaves like an imperial power in the Middle East, a colonizing power, and the leading war power of the Middle East. China is completely different. China is only present commercially. It's only present as a calm, stabilizing voice. It's only present as one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. China has a big interest in Middle East stability because of energy and other geopolitical conditions, but China's just has nothing to do with being an imperial power. It never was for an overseas, in an overseas sense, and I don't think it's going to be.
Yeah. We had the conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, on Sky News. She said something so much amazing. First time I've heard that. That was surprising. She said that Israel is fighting a proxy war on the part of the United Kingdom. How can you make sense of that?
Wow. I missed the statement. A proxy war vis-a-vis whom, was she saying?
It's about, I don't know, the region, Palestinians.
Look, I can tell you, I have a theorem that almost all world problems go back to the British. So the British have made a mess in so many parts of the world. The list is extremely long. It's also true that while Britain lost its empire basically 80 years ago, it still fantasizes that it is a great imperial power. And when you hear a statement like you just said, which I haven't heard, so I can't fully interpret it, but it's a kind of absurdity.
Professor, let me play it for you. I think that would be helpful if you heard that.
The Prime Minister joined. Do you think that Mr. Netanyahu's language on this is justified?
I'm not here to police the language of the Prime Minister of Israel.
I'm not asking you to police it. I'm asking
what he has said.
People need to know where you stand.
Yeah, but I've been very clear where I stand. Hamas is a terrorist group. They are not our friends.
I'm talking about what you think about the Israelis'
Yes, but it's all related. Who funds Hamas? Iran. An enemy of this country. An enemy of this country. Israel is fighting a proxy war on behalf of the UK, just like Ukraine is on behalf of the West of Western Europe against Russia. We have to get serious. We have to get serious. There was a terrorist plot in London against the Israeli embassy. We saw 2 Jewish members of the Israeli embassy in DC killed. Whose side are we on? We need to make sure that the hostages are returned. No one wants to see a war in Gaza. Palestinians are suffering. Netanyahu is complaining that he thinks our leaders are carrying out the wrong action. He has every right to say that. What I want to see is Keir Starmer making sure that he is on the right side of British national interest. That cannot be on the side.
Yeah, British national interest.
Oh my God. Something's happened to Britain. It is so pathetic. One of these characters after the next. It's absolutely shocking. Now, if you put Starmer there, he'd be the same fool. If you put Boris Johnson there before, the same idiocy. One after another. I don't know where to start, but Britain is in such a tailspin. Of course, who am I to talk? We have Donald Trump. The collapse of political leadership in the North Atlantic is kind of like a coda to the overall end of Western hegemony. Not only is there the end of Western dominance in the world, but you kind of put the icing on the cake by having this political idiocy that we were just watching on this film. Absolutely unaccountable, vulgar, but par for the course. Starmer's no better. It's just awful. The degradation of British politics.
The tragedy is that they're playing the same role in Ukraine. They're doing
exactly the same role. All they know is war and these stupid comments and this vainglory of empire and telling people what to do. Idiocy. Starmer is just such a fool. But by the way, so was Boris Johnson. And Johnson played exactly the same role. So this is interesting because this is deep state phenomena. This transcends parties. We have basically the same thing in the United States, though I want to say Trump is trying, maybe not successfully, maybe fitfully, maybe episodically, but he's trying, I think, to end the war in Ukraine. Starmer's not even remotely trying to end the war in Ukraine.
And yesterday, Donald Trump said that Vladimir Putin is so crazy. He's killing a lot of people, but not just soldiers. They're killing. He was talking about civilians. What is the main goal of this mainstream policy? Because when you go out, and he talked recently with Vladimir Putin, it was a phone call, more than 2 hours. They were talking about many things, not just Ukraine. But who's forcing Donald Trump is in the position that he's taking right now, which it seems that he's somehow feeling that he needs to leave the scene, to let it in the hands of Ukrainians and Russians to make some sort of solution, to make some sort of settlement.
No, but he said something even more than that now when he said Putin's absolutely crazy. He said maybe we have to put on sanctions again. So it's not extricating the U.S., it's reverting to the mainstream deep state, which is possible because he's surrounded by Marco Rubio and Waltz and Kellogg and Lindsey Graham. And we didn't have 30 years of warmongering for nothing, and it didn't just go away on January 20th, 2025. We have a military-industrial complex that is the basis of the American empire, and that still is there. And Trump's trying to end a war, but no one likes to end war among these imperial powers. Even a country like Britain, which lost its empire 80 years ago, doesn't like to end war. France loves the warmongering right now. The United States is the only country where the leader, it seems once in a while, to be trying to wind down the war. But then a statement like today could mean just a reversion back to where we were before. Putin didn't do anything, quote, absolutely crazy. The Iranians launched massive drone attacks, including on Moscow in recent days. The Western European governments are so incredible in not saying one word about how to actually reach peace. They talk about a ceasefire, but not how to actually reach peace. that to call Putin crazy and not call Zelensky, Starmer, Macron, Tusk, Merz as warmongering, it's just strange. And it's very disturbing because basically it may be that Trump doesn't have the stamina to persevere. Maybe he doesn't understand. Maybe he doesn't have the personal stamina. Maybe he's so much under the assault of the deep state. But the lines today were definitely not helpful to peace and definitely not helpful to Ukraine.
If you were to mention the main difficulty on the part of the Trump administration, would be the technical parts of what's going on in Ukraine, or somehow the bigger picture, the strategy of the United States in dealing with Russia and the way that they're getting some sort of pressure from the deep state?
It's the latter. Look, basically, the U.S. gambled that it could pull Ukraine into the Western orbit and do it with NATO enlargement and make Russia fold. And that was the bet. And that bet was wrong. For Russia, this was such a core set of issues that when the United States helped to overthrow a pro-Russian government or Russia-friendly government in Ukraine next door, when the United States built up the largest army in Europe, actually in Ukraine, during Trump 1 period, when the United States refused to negotiate over the NATO question at all. This is the deep state at work. And Trump came in with the right idea that this isn't in America's interest and it's not working. Most importantly, from Trump's point of view, is this failed. This was a gambit. This was, remember, Americans play poker. This was, trying to bet the pot with a pair of twos. And they vastly overplayed their hand. They bluffed, or they believed their own press releases, but they thought that that Putin would fold, if you keep the poker analogy, and he didn't fold. So Trump came in and said, I don't want to play this hand anymore. This is Biden's hand. That all makes sense. But as soon as he said it, the entire political class of the United States and Western Europe jumped up and down. Oh, that's appeasement. You can't do that. You're just doing Trump's, Putin's line and Putin's interest. What do they think? What's the plan that Starmer has? How many Ukrainians is he going to kill according to his plan? Is it another 500,000? What is the plan? Is Starmer really going to defeat Russia, Britain, which can't even keep its clinics open anymore? It's really going to defeat Russia right now? So they don't have a plan. They're just warmongering, and as long as it's the Ukrainians dying, that's fine. And they portray themselves as friends of Ukraine. Part of the problem is Zelensky. He's a dictator. He can't let go either, but he's killing his own people. Plain and simple. For what? For what prospect? What are the costs, the benefits, and the likelihoods? People don't want to talk about any of that. But the vast likelihood is that all this is a path to continued war that destroys Ukraine in the end. That's the path we're on. And Trump has been trying to get off that path, but whether he's really staying off the path or not remains to be seen. And his posting today about Putin gone absolutely crazy, this is a very bad sign. It shows that he's succumbing to all the normal politics of Washington.
Can we understand why did Russia decide to talk directly with Ukrainians, because before they said they're not going to talk with Zelensky and his administration because Zelensky is not officially the president of Ukraine. Is that related to what Donald Trump wasn't able to get from Ukraine, or somehow was manipulated by the Europeans? Go ahead, Professor.
No, I think Russia has said all along for years they want to end this at the negotiating table, but they want the negotiations to be about ending the underlying causes of the war. It makes perfect sense, by the way. You want to end this war. It's not by freezing the conflict so that the war can start again. It's by going to the root causes: NATO enlargement, collective security, territorial issues, and so on. So Russia has not resisted negotiating. It's laid out its position. It's probably negotiable in some parts, but to find out, you have to negotiate. Europe doesn't want to negotiate. Europe doesn't lay out any position. Zelensky's position is total victory, total capitulation of Russia, war crimes trials, reparations. It's kind of a delusional list that is the opposite of really trying to get an end to the conflict. So I think it's not surprising that Putin said, let's negotiate. By the way, just as a footnote, they didn't say who they would sign with. They said they would negotiate terms. And they're going to exchange some papers on this. So Russia will be stating, here are the terms and why of ending this conflict. Ukraine apparently won't do that. The Western world won't do that. They don't talk about how to actually end the war, because that would force them to get into issues like, should NATO really expand? To this day, the Europeans are saying yes. This is nuts, by the way. This is just the recipe to completely destroy Ukraine, to carry on with such imbecilities. Sorry. NATO should never have tried to expand to Ukraine. It was reckless. It was warmongering. It was known by experienced people that it could lead to deadly conflict. It never should have been done. But my God, given what's happened since 2022, for Europeans to continue to say, absolutely, Ukraine will join NATO, is shocking to me. We're going to have to finish up shortly.
Thank you so much, Professor Sachs. Great pleasure, as always.
Well, great to be with you, and we'll continue. Lots to talk about, and these issues are unfortunately not going away anytime soon.
Yeah. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. A trade deficit is not a signal that other countries are somehow taking advantage of the United States. It is only a measure that the United States is spending more than it earns. Thank you so much for convening this ARIA formula meeting at an extremely important time and on a crucial topic. The crucial topic is how we can protect, preserve, and extend true multilateralism. That is governance according to principle, according to ethics, according to international law, and according to the standards of the UN Charter. We are, of course, in a multipolar world where power is widely dispersed across the world. But we are not fully in a multilateral world because of the abuses of the international system, as you have spelled out, Ambassador. Last year, I published a study. It's called the Index of Countries' Support for UN-Based Multilateralism. The purpose of the study was to measure how close or how far countries are from alignment with UN-based multilateralism. I am sorry to say that even last year, before this new round of unilateral tariff measures of the United States, of the 193 UN member states, the United States ranked last 193rd in the world, making it the country least aligned with UN multilateralism. This is because the United States takes many measures that are outside of the UN-based system, that are in violation of the UN-based system, that walk away from UN commitments, and the United States votes against most of the world, most of the time, or much of the time, let me say, to be more precise, in the UN General Assembly. You have convened this meeting in part because of the immediate crisis that has occurred because of U.S. unilateral sanctions. These were called reciprocal tariffs, but they had nothing to do with reciprocity of tariffs. And let me explain briefly. President Trump made the claim that the U.S. trade deficit is caused by other countries abusing the United States. That if the U.S. is running a trade deficit, as it does with more than 100 countries, that this is somehow the fault of those other countries. Well, I have been teaching international macroeconomics for 44 years, and I can say unequivocally that a trade deficit is not a signal that other countries are somehow taking advantage of the United States. It is only a measure that the United States is spending more than it earns. In other words, that its total consumption and investment is greater than the gross national product. That is a statistical identity. The current account balance, which is the comprehensive measure of the net trade of the United States in goods and services with the rest of the world, that deficit equals the excess of U.S. spending over U.S. income. Now, why does the U.S. spend more than it earns? The reason is that the saving rate in the United States is very low, unlike China, where people and businesses and government are thrifty. In the United States, the saving rates are low of both the private sector and the public sector. But most notably, the U.S. federal government is running an enormous deficit, between 6 and 7% of our gross domestic product, $2 trillion of deficit per year. And that spills over into a current account deficit of $1 trillion per year. So the tariff measures are utterly unjustified by the economic claims of the U.S. government. The tariffs are directed towards a trade deficit that is not the fault of China's partners, but is the result of America's large budget deficits and low private saving. And so the United States is blaming other countries for its own economic policies. And this is extremely important. There is no excuse for these unilateral tariffs. Not remotely are they related to unfair practices of the rest of the world somehow cheating the United States. Now, the claim of the U.S. government was never examined by Congress. It was never debated in the public. It was made as a matter of an emergency decree that also, in my view, not only violates multilateralism, but also the U.S. Constitution, where Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution absolutely gives the power of tariffs to the U.S. Congress, not to the President of the United States. There are already several court hearings in the United States challenging the legality of the U.S. government's unilateral imposition of tariffs. I find no justification whatsoever economically for the actions that were taken, nor did the financial markets worldwide, which began to enter into a panic, and that forced the administration, in most cases, to reverse what it had done. Unfortunately, there is continuing damage to the world economy, including vis-a-vis China. Now, I want to emphasize that this unilateralism takes many forms. The tariffs is just one. And if you'll permit me, Ambassador, I would like to just list briefly. The United States is the biggest user of coercive economic measures other than tariffs, putting on sanctions on different companies, on individuals abroad, on banking sectors abroad. And so the U.S. is by far the biggest user of unilateral coercive measures. And the UN General Assembly repeatedly declares such unilateral coercive measures to be illegal against the UN Charter. And they do enormous harm to populations all over the world, depriving populations of access to basic health care, to the most basic needs of food and clean water. They raise mortality rates. In other words, they are not only illegal, but they are extremely damaging to the health and well-being, especially of very poor people. The U.S., in addition, confiscates the assets of other countries, as it has done with the Russian Federation, with Venezuela, with Iran, with North Korea, with Afghanistan, and with other countries. It simply freezes the dollar holdings of other countries with which it has foreign policy differences. And this is an abuse of the prerogative of the role of the dollar in international settlements, because it is used by the United States as a weapon rather than as a payments settlement system. And this has become very serious. Under the U.S. Impetus, Europe, too, has engaged in these unilateral coercive measures, including the confiscation of $300 billion of Russian foreign exchange reserves, which is, in my opinion, blatantly against international law and against world interest. The United States, unfortunately, engages in many covert regime change operations, meaning that it engages not only in economic bullying, but in actually the attempt or the actual overthrow of governments. These have been now documented in very serious studies, counting by one excellent study, 64 covert regime change operations during the period 1947 to 1989. This is a staggering fact. No country should be overturning the government of another country under the UN Charter. Unfortunately, the U.S. is also engaged in arms buildups all over the world. No other country comes close to having the U.S. situation of 750 overseas military bases in 80 countries. This by itself, in my opinion, is highly detrimental to American security and a threat to the global peace. But it leads to arms buildups all over the world. I'm sad to say that the United States also is impeding the work of the UN system. When it comes to trade, the key to a rule-based trade system is the World Trade Organization, which the United States should take pride in helping to bring into existence. And yet the United States, since 2019, has blocked the appellate panel of the WTO so that dispute settlements cannot take place now at WTO because the appellate body does not have the requisite judges because the United States is deliberately blocking the filling of positions of WTO so that that crucial rules-based institution can do its job. And finally, I would add that the United States has unilaterally departed from fundamental treaties of global significance, including from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002, which was perhaps the single biggest destabilization vis-a-vis Russia, because the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was a bulwark of U.S.-Russia stability. The U.S. unilaterally abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty in 2019, and the United States is walking out, once again under President Trump, of the Paris Climate Agreement, which is a crucial global agreement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for world security. This is all quite dire. In other words, the break of the multilateralism, the fact that the United States, such a powerful country and such an influential country in the world, is the least multilateral of all of the UN member states, poses major risks and challenges to the world. And I just want to mention them in brief and then to close. First are the broken economic relations. Economic trade, international trade, is not a win-lose proposition. It is a win-win proposition. When the United States and China trade, both sides benefit. When the trade relations are ruptured by unilateral tariffs, both sides lose. This is extremely sad. Of course, it's the poorest countries that lose the most when the WTO rules-based system faces such a crisis. The second cost, of course, is the arms race. The world is spending trillions of dollars per year on armaments right now, and God forbid they should be used. We must not, of course, use these armaments, but the waste of resources directed at these armaments is staggering. Many countries, including in Europe, are cutting their development aid budget to build their military budget. This is unacceptable for a peaceful world, and it will not satisfy our security in any way. The third cost, of course, is open conflict. These unilateral measures lead to war. And we have several wars raging precisely because countries are not obeying the international system. It was decided by the International Court of Justice last year, for example, that Israel is violating international law by extending beyond its borders of the 4th of June, 1967. And the UN General Assembly will hold a high-level session on the implementation of the two-state solution in June because of this violation. Israel, sad to say, is also one of the lowest-ranked countries in the world in multilateralism. So we get open conflict as a result of this. We also have the dire reality that we have come far too close to nuclear confrontation on several occasions, and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists tells the world that we are but 89 seconds from midnight on nuclear confrontation. This is another risk that comes from the unilateralism and the bullying. Of course, when we have conflict, when we have bullying, when we have unilateralism, we don't gain solutions that we desperately need for climate change, for the green economy, for the future of a sustainable world, for the Sustainable Development Goals, as you mentioned, Ambassador. And so the diversion from an absolutely crucial agenda is one of the telling costs of all of this. We are all suffering from unilateralism. We all suffer from bullying. This is a lose-lose proposition. We created 80 years ago our forefathers did a wondrous job to create the United Nations, to make a system of international law, a system of international respect, and we have the responsibility to promote it. And I thank you for today's very important session, because it is extremely important that we reverse from unilateralism and promote actively multilateralism and the UN Charter at every turn as the key for our safety, for our survival, and for our sustainable development.